Now we're going to Dave's guys, and we'll show you the list here. Jalen Hurts, Aaron Rodgers, a couple quarterbacks that a lot of fantasy managers certainly either love or have loved in the past. Naji Harris and Antonio Gibson at the running back position. Deontay Johnson at receiver and George Kittle at the tight end spot. So, Dave, let's talk about these quarterbacks. We'll start with Jalen Hurts. And so at the beginning of this process, you were a little bit concerned about Hurts. I think at one point you even said you thought he might be benched in favor of the great Gardner Minshew if he struggled. But you got a chance to see him play, and now you're all on board with Jalen Hurts as a top 5 quarterback.
It's not just getting the chance to see him practice. It's also reading all the reports, not to mention reading all of the obvious tea leaves that the Eagles put out there with their moves this offseason. They didn't add another quarterback at any point. They added A.J. Brown. They clearly want to throw the football more than they did at the end of last year. And Jalen Hurts looked good in practice. The reports from training camp before they were visiting down here with the Dolphins, they were good. And then seeing him in person kind of put it over the top for me. I like the way that he was making decisions with the football. There are some accuracy issues. He will make an occasional bad throw from time to time. But the rushing upside, man, it is there like it was last year. And I fully expect him to finish as a top 5 fantasy quarterback.
Give everybody your bold prediction on Jalen Hurts.
He's going to be the number 1 quarterback in fantasy. I think I wrote that the night that they traded for A.J. Brown, is that he had the upside to be the number 1 quarterback in fantasy. I just think you get a quarterback who could run for 1,000 yards and gets A.J. Brown added. We saw what that did for Kyler Murray. We saw what it did for Josh Allen. This could be one of the best offense, one of the best teams in the NFL this year.
He could throw for 4,000. He could run for 1,000. He could score 40 total touchdowns. There's just so much to love about Jalen Hurts, and everything, like Dave said, you've heard this offseason has been positive. The exact opposite for Aaron Rodgers, unfortunately, though, because he loses Devontae Adams. For what it's worth, he loses Marquez Valdes-Scantling as well. And they bring in Christian Watson as a second-round wide receiver, Romeo Doubs as a fourth-round wide receiver, Sammy Watkins on his 100th team because he's 100 years old, and Randall Cobb is still there. So, Dave, the receiving core is clearly the big issue for Aaron Rodgers, but he surprised us before as a 2-time MVP. What's the concern about Rodgers for this season?
For the record, Sammy Watkins is 29, not 100. But he might end up being the best, maybe in dog years, the best receiver that Aaron Rodgers throws to, and that could be a problem because Watkins has a hard time staying healthy. Let's face it, Watkins and Cobb probably going to be on the field as starters for Green Bay along with Allen Lazard when they roll with 3 receiver sets, and I think they're going to do a lot of 3 receiver sets this year. And it's problematic. He's not as explosive as he used to be. Same thing with Randall Cobb. And Allen Lazard has never necessarily been explosive. He did make a bunch of explosive plays last year, but it wasn't because of his traits. It was because he was open, because he wasn't the number 1 receiver. Now he's the number 1 receiver in this offense. It wouldn't surprise me if Patrick Peterson lined up against him in week 1, and that's a guy who can still shut down dudes that don't have deep speed. So I'm worried about Lazard as soon as week 1. And so we're putting it all on the running backs to make up for that. I don't know if we've seen a quarterback finish as a top 10 option having running backs, plural, be his top targets in an offense. So I'm worried about Rodgers getting the job done and being an MVP caliber type quarterback when he doesn't have the guy that he had the most chemistry with, had great timing with. That guy's gone. And they don't have anybody there that can replace him in the early half of the season. And the one that's got the athleticism to actually do it didn't really practice much in training camp and is a rookie. That's Christian Watson. Maybe he makes an impact in the second half.
The thing I think is going to have to save Rodgers is the touchdowns, because he'll roll out of bed with 4,400 yards, and you know he's not going to throw interceptions. It's a matter of, will the run game get them down there close enough to, it's 8 touchdowns for Lazard, it's 6 touchdowns for Watkins, it's 8 touchdowns for Robert Tonyan, it's 5 for Dobbs. You know, it's just that's the type of year he's going to have, I think, to reward fantasy managers, and then obviously what the running backs do, catching the ball as well. So he could still surprise us, but I think the consensus from all of us is, don't reach for Aaron Rodgers. Certainly don't reach for him as a top 10 quarterback. Last time I checked the average draft position for CBS Sports, he was the 9th quarterback off the board. Just does not make a lot of sense. I know the name. The game just may not match up for this season. All right, Dave, let's talk about Naji Harris, because I think at one point you had him ranked over Christian McCaffrey, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Now, what's the concern about Naji? Is it the foot? Is it the offense? What's the worry?
It's the foot, it's the offensive line, and it's how the quarterbacks have played in Pittsburgh. So before preseason began and before training camp began, my philosophy was that the quarterbacks would be an issue in Pittsburgh and that the team would have to lean heavily on Naji Harris. Well, Mitchell Trubisky played not bad, and the same with rookie Kenny Pickett. So they've got 2 quarterbacks that can actually be usable, dangerous options, not necessarily top flight options, but guys who can maneuver around a bad offensive line. And you know how good that receiving core is there in Pittsburgh. We knew that Deontay Johnson would be a top target getter. We knew that Chase Claypool would be a thing, but George Pickens has also stepped up, and Pat Freiermuth has shown some explosiveness in the preseason. So all these things kind of come together, and it makes me think that maybe the Steelers won't be so run dominant. And if they were run dominant, I don't know if this is the offensive line that can get the job done to put Naji Harris in a position to have over 1,500 total yards and 15 touchdowns. I think his ceiling is now that, but the floor is a little bit lower. I'm penciling him in for 1,200 total yards and 9 touchdowns. That's still worthy of a first-round pick, but it's the back half of the.
All right, Dave, let's stay with the Steelers here because you have Deontay Johnson on this list also. And so, and I want to come to you on this also, just in terms of both these guys. So, Dave, just talk us through quickly on just, where you've come from with Deontay, and then Heath, how you feel about the whole Steelers offense.
I like the way that Deontay Johnson exploded in the preseason. And again, going back to the quarterback, Mitchell Trubisky maneuvered himself well behind that offensive line. He was mostly accurate. Same thing with Kenny Pickett. These guys are going to end up being factors, and I think they're good factors for Deontay Johnson. So I expect him to be more efficient, not necessarily getting as many targets as he's had in the past, but certainly a higher yards per catch and maybe a couple more explosive.
Yeah, I think you look at one of the first things that I do when I build week 1 projections is what's the implied point total for each team. That's kind of you figure out how many points does Vegas think they're going to score. The Steelers are one of 3 teams projected for or implied for 19 points this week. The other 2 are the Texans and the Giants. That tells you about the quality of offense right now that Vegas thinks the Steelers have, and that gives you concern for everybody on the team because if you don't score a lot of points, it's hard to score a lot of fantasy points.
Where does Pickens factor for you? Where does Claypool factor for you?
I like Pickens more than Claypool. They're both flex-type players. I do think there's more upside for Pickens, and I think he could hurt both Harris and Johnson by drawing more targets.
Any room for Freiermuth?
Very little. It's got to be in the red zone. He's going to have another year like what I said he can't repeat last year. I don't think he's going to be a 100-target tight end. 7
touchdowns last year. Hopefully he finds the end zone quite a bit for those of you still drafting him as a number 1 guy. All right, Dave, we spent a lot of time talking about the Washington backfield. We know the situation. When this training camp started, it was still Antonio Gibson's as the starter. We thought Brian Robinson might be a short yardage option. Then Gibson had the hamstring problem, and Robinson was getting first-team reps. Then Robinson basically took over for Gibson after Gibson had the fumble in the preseason game. And then the big story clearly was Brian Robinson getting shot in the attempted robbery. And now we don't know exactly when he will return. He's on short-term IR. Hopefully back after 4 weeks. We've heard differing stories. Maybe just going to be 4 weeks out. Could be November until we see Brian Robinson. So Gibson now back in the good graces of fantasy managers by default, but you're still concerned.
Yes, because he's not the only running back that's there. J.D. McKissic is healthy, and he could factor in. And if the Commanders are smart, they'll throw to both of these running backs because that's what Gibson's really good at. You put him in space, let him make a move after making a catch, and he can pick up chunks of yardage. He's not a north-south type of a running back. He's proved that over the past few years. He's just happened to do well scoring touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. So I think his upside is really capped because if Robinson comes back, and if the man can survive a robbery, imagine what he can do to opposing NFL defenses. He could be dominant when it comes to scoring touchdowns and being that north-south rushing presence that the Commanders hoped he'd be from the jump. Now he'll do it later in the season. And then there's another factor. What happens if Gibson screws up again? And the coaching staff just says, that's it. We can't trust him anymore. He's going to stay on kick returns, and he'll split some passing down reps with J.D. McKissic. Then he's a bust of a pick. So I'm nervous to take him and put him on my fantasy team. Would I use him in week 1 against Jacksonville? Absolutely. But I can't count on him to be a good fantasy running back past, I would call it late October.
Yeah, it's really all going to come down to when Brian Robinson returns. Because if Robinson returns after 4 weeks and he's ready to go, takes over the job, Gibson may not see the field again for what we like to see. But if Gibson is the guy for 6 weeks, for 8 weeks, anything longer than that, you might get a steal when you're getting Antonio Gibson. So it's really just a matter of how you're building your fantasy roster and your expectations for what Gibson can give you. I think he's a good flex to start the season, great starter to start the season in week 1, and we'll see where things go from there when it comes to Brian Robinson. All right, Dave, quickly on George Kittle. We had the conversation, Goddard, Schultz, Kittle. You mentioned that you like Schultz and Goddard and Schultz better than Kittle. Can Kittle still reward fantasy managers, though, as a top 5 fantasy option? Just give us a quick 30 seconds on that.
No, I don't think he can. I think he's going to fall short of it. And it has everything to do with Trey Lance being the starter to begin the season. When he played last year, they ran the ball over 55% of the time when they did throw. Lance wasn't looking for Kittle. I believe he ran 99 routes or played 99 passing snaps and only ran on like 70 of those routes, something like that. And he only had 4 targets from Trey Lance. I'm nervous about what George Kittle can do with Trey Lance under center. I think Lance is going to get every opportunity to be the starter for the 49ers well into the first month of the season. If he messes up and it's Garoppolo, my opinion will change. I'll want Kittle to be the tight end there, but we don't know if that's going to happen. There's certainly a chance that Trey Lance plays well enough to keep the job over the course of the entire season without George Kittle having to be a huge factor. So I'm taking a step back on Kittle, and I think the rankings show that with Schultz and Goddard ahead of him.
The one thing that I found that was encouraging, reading some stuff about Kittle this weekend, was that the 49ers keeping 4 tight ends on their roster was a lot to do with having better blocking options along with Kittle to free him up more in the passing game. Specifically, I was reading a story in The Athletic about Tyler Kroft and how they feel more comfortable with him as a blocker, and that will allow Kittle to run more routes because Kyle Shanahan wants him more involved in the passing game. So those of you still buying into George Kittle, I think that will certainly help if he gets more opportunities, clearly more opportunities to make plays and produce as well.